Welcome to the View magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. This podcast was started by and for women in the justice system. Every week, we bring you people at the front lines and the intersections of justice, art, mental health, and the humanities. This week, we bring you Jeremy Moore, a solicitor with a national reputation for his work in high-profile and serious crime work, as well as assisting clubs and athletes in sports-related matters. Jeremy recently opened his own legal practice, More Justice. He has a particular expertise in representing clients in cases before the Court of Appeal and in applications to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, with a fine eye for detail, looking to uncover new evidence that can undermine a conviction. Madalena Alberto spoke with Jeremy, who told us that he's an expert in the area of international sports law, having studied for a master's degree in international sports law at ISDE in Madrid and a master's in sports directorship at MMU. Jeremy's undertaken some of the country's most complex and high-profile cases, including defending Barry George in his acquittal for the murder of TV presenter Jill Dando, and representing nurse Victorino Chua following deaths at Stepping Hill Hospital. He ran his own firm, Carter Moore, until it went into administration, following brutal cuts and late payments by the Ministry of Justice in its attempts to undermine access to justice and the legal aid scheme for the most vulnerable people. The firm had around a dozen staff members, according to the most recent accounts filed covering 2017 to 2018.
Jeremy, thank you so much for giving your time to come and speak to us. If you could just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what sparked your interest in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've been doing criminal defence work for around 30 years, so I'm showing my age. I qualified in around 1994, and since my qualification, I've mainly exclusively been doing criminal defence work, more so serious end of work, high profile work. Particularly the last few years, most of my work is appellant work and miscarriages of justice, that sort of thing. To be honest, I'd like to be one of those people who says I've always wanted to do law, and I've always had an interest in the justice system. I had no idea, when I trained, what I wanted to do. I didn't originally do a law degree. I took a business studies degree, and there was a law section on that course which I found quite interesting, and sort of not being ready to get a job when I finished my degree, I thought, well, I'll do law and train as a solicitor. And even then I thought, well, I'll qualify as a solicitor, but I'll do something else eventually. But here I am 30 years later. And I actually, I didn't really have any thoughts of being involved in criminal work, to be honest. When I was a trainee, I worked for a general practice firm that sort of did a bit of everything apart from crime. And then they had someone who joined the firm who did criminal work, and I worked for him and ended up getting involved in work with him. And in fact, one of the first cases I worked on was an SFO prosecution, where I was basically just shut in a room with a client every day to go through the papers with him for months, and then sat in on the trial for 3 months, and he was acquitted. I think that's probably where I really got a taste for it. I mean, growing up, looking back, I think I always had a strong sense of right and wrong and what was unfair, and also I think fighting for the underdog. So I think probably that's where sort of going in and, representing people charged with serious offences, that's where my motivation comes from.
Thank you. And I'm sure it's a very good feeling when you feel like justice has been served and you're a part of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's no better feel, especially, cases where you feel someone has really been wronged, particularly with appeals where, they can often have dragged on for years before you get involved, and then to see things finally turned around and be put right, then that's really the best feeling that there is in this job, I think.
Jeremy, you've had a long and successful career defending and appealing the sentences of some of the most notorious cases. What would you say it was like working to help people who were considered dangerous and a threat to society?
Yeah, I think it goes back again to this sort of championing the cause of the underdog, and these cases where often the press demonise people because, at the time they want someone for what's often very serious offence without looking at, is this the right person? And I say it goes back to championing the underdog a bit, where, someone who everyone pointing their fingers at, so being able to look into things and say, well, okay, you're painted as this person, is that right? What actually happened? But as well, even in cases where they have difficulties in defending themselves, there's always a backstory, and it's very easy to demonise a person and say, well, they're this, they're that. But everyone who is involved as a defendant in serious offences, there's something's happened in their life or has led them down that path. And to a large extent, they're a victim of society as much as the actual victim of the offence. So it's sort of, having someone there to stick up for them. Of course, without defence solicitors, then there would be no justice system. There would be no justice. People couldn't be put on trial without someone putting their case forward. At the end of the day, you're just there, I'm just there to put someone's case forward for them, whether it be right or wrong or truthful. At the end of the day, it's giving their voice and them having the right, to put their voice over and their version of events as to what happened.
Yes, and they need good people like you to do that job as well. So thank you. If you can speak a little bit about this, which were your most memorable cases?
Yeah, probably my most memorable case was representing Barry George. He was charged with the murder of Jill Dando, who was the television presenter, and she was a very high-profile figure at the time in the 90s when she was murdered. And Barry George was an interesting chap, but he was, at the end of the day, an easy target. I don't know how much you recall about the investigation, probably not, because it was a long time ago, no reason for you to, but it's a case where there've been no leads for, I think, nearly a year going into the investigation. And obviously there was a lot of pressure on the police to have someone charged with this offence. And all of a sudden, out of nothing, this chap, Barry George, was suddenly arrested and charged. He had learning difficulties. He lived on his own in, assisted housing, spent his days just walking around the area. He was a very easy target for the police to pick up. He's a local weirdo. He's our man. When the reality was, it was a shooting carried out in broad daylight by a professional who managed to escape the scene with no trace. This was some poor chap with learning difficulties who in reality had no access to guns, but happened to be in the area because he lived in the area. And they sort of painted him in his trial as some sort of obsessive figure who, was obsessed with celebrities, in particular Jill Dando, and that he had kept magazines with her picture in and this, that, and the other. The reality was he was a hoarder. He had hundreds of magazines, which any magazines at the time contained pictures of Jill Dando. They weren't circled or highlighted or tore out or anyway. He just had hundreds and hundreds of magazines stored in his house, which if you took some of them out, you're bound to find pictures of Jill Dando. So the police had painted him, and in turn the press, as there was some weirdo with some obsession about this woman, obsession with celebrity. He was stalking, it was this and that. And the reality was it was, some troubled individual with learning difficulties who happened to hoard a lot of media paperwork and magazines. So he was, when I first met him, I think he'd already been in prison for 5 years, and he'd written to me actually about some prison law issue that he had. I remember at the time thinking, well, hey, I know this name. Well, I don't know if I can help him on the prison law issue, but I'll go and see him because he's clearly someone who, has had a lot of difficulties. And I went to see him at the time. Obviously I read a lot about his case and was he having any appeal? Where was that going? So, well, in actual fact, he had lost an appeal. Would I be able to help him with that as well? I said, well, yeah, more than happy to look at it. And he'd actually submitted an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission with the help of his family. So they're involved sort of looking into that, going through all the evidence, drafting additional representations on his CCRC application, which ultimately was successful. We ended up in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal overturned the conviction. Then we had a retrial where he was acquitted. So sort of going back to what we're saying about, satisfactory outcomes, that was definitely right up with them. I mean, I remember after his acquittal, at the end of the day, as he came out, there were members of the jury who were actually sort of there because they were so happy they could see by the evidence in court that there really was no case against him. And, they were just happy to see that justice had finally been done. So in terms of memorable cases and outcomes, that was definitely right up there.
Wow. And I love the fact that you took an interest in this case and you were able to help. And I see that there's a lot of police work that you have to do, investigative work.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this case was interesting, and a lot of the work at trial had been focused on forensic evidence. And what happened was a single particle of gunpowder residue had been found in his pocket months after the offence. It wasn't a direct match for residue that was found on the victim, but there were similarities when it wasn't like a fingerprint. You could say, well, yeah, it's certainly the same thing. They could say, well, there's consistencies. So a lot of focus at this trial have been paid on trying to see where his coat could have been contaminated. When the police opened it at the police station, could it have been contaminated there? And when they took photographs, could this particle got in there? What no one had actually looked at is, well, what is the relevance of this particle? Did it actually mean anything in the, as I say, found months after the event? It wasn't a direct match for particle found on the victim. Did it actually mean anything? And when we had experts look into that and statisticians, what they actually ultimately said was, well, there's probably as much possibility of someone having that particle in their pocket, whether they were the murderer or they were just a random person walking the street who happened to pick up a particle that happened to be in the air. So the reality of it was, wherever that particle came from, it didn't really matter. The fact of it was, it didn't mean anything because it didn't make him any more likely to be the perpetrator than if it was just a random person walking in the street. So it was almost sort of doing the police investigation in reverse, packaging that evidence and sort of saying, well, what does this actually mean? Did it mean anything? And in reality, it didn't. That's why the Court of Appeal said, well, no, this evidence, which was obviously key to his conviction, it had no relevance. In fact, at his retrial, that evidence was excluded because it didn't take the case any further. And without that, there really wasn't any case apart from, this stupid argument that he had all these magazines with their photos on and little things like that. There was nothing.
Wow, it's a great success story. Jeremy, you do a lot of criminal law. I've seen you do also sports law. But do you work a lot with women, and is it different working with women defendants?
Yeah, I do work with women, and I have worked with women. In fact, I had another great success of mine was a mother and daughter who were charged with the murder of their father, who disappeared to the Caribbean and never seen again. Nobody was found. Nothing. It was just assumed because he disappeared at that time that there was clearly some disagreement between them and the father that they killed him. In fact, they were ultimately convicted of his murder. But again, the Court of Appeal had a look at it and said, well, they just couldn't say if he was murdered, if it was, who was responsible, when it was done, etc. And they overturned the conviction. So that was another satisfactory case. What I find is that I get a lot fewer inquiries from women. And I think, well, that's because they find it a lot harder to get access to the justice system, whether they feel more marginalised in terms of contacting solicitors in the first place, or they think, well, I'm not going to be able to get any funding, I'm not going to be able to pay for this, I'm going to be in difficulties in getting something started. Yeah, I do find that I get much fewer inquiries from women, to a ridiculous extent. I would say as I get maybe a dozen inquiries a week, on most occasions, none of them will be from women. So maybe perhaps in a month I might one inquiry from a woman, but then, because of how things are with legal aid, particularly legal aid with regards to appeals, it's harder and harder to assist people unless, you're doing work on a pro bono basis or they're able to finance it. So, and I think it's particularly the case with women, they're often in a much more difficult situation than men, and particularly because I think, when I talk about having backstories, I think with women there is always some sort of a backstory as to how they ended up in the situations they are, whether it's difficult upbringings or abusive relationships, etc. I do think they find themselves in a much weaker position in the criminal justice system than men do, and with much lesser access to the legal system, which is really concerning.
Yes, that's really sad. And I think that's also what The View is trying to highlight and see how to better that situation. You have started a new firm.
Yes.
What has motivated you to do that? And what will you focus on more?
Okay, well, I actually had my own practice for 16 years up until 2020. And I then went to join a big firm, took my work there, and I left there in July of this year. I found basically that bigger firms, I suppose understandably because they have bigger overheads, etc., but they're a lot more cost focused and a lot less client focused. And when you're with a bigger firm and it's not just within your control, you're a lot more restricted in the kind of work you can do. And for instance, doing pro bono work or just sort of, I had a client phone me just before I spoke to you, who said, oh, look, I know you're dealing with my appeal, but I'm having problems with getting home leave. Could you make a phone call for me? And, my answer is, of course, yeah, I'll make a phone call. I'm not going to time record every minute and charge you for every phone call. And later than I write, when you're working for a bigger firm, you're always having to justify your existence. There's always targets and, I did this work for a client, but I'm not being paid for it. But I want to help him by making this phone call or doing this going the extra mile for him because we need assistance with it. I found it a lot harder and more restrictive working with a bigger firm. So enjoying far greater freedom again now, working for myself and just being able to, give a more all-round service to clients and sort of not watching every minute that I'm working and every little thing that I'm doing. And also, sort of being able to take on more pro bono work rather than having to justify every single second of my time. I think within a smaller niche firm, you can have a much better ethos with clients rather than sort of almost like a factory where, you're piling cases high and doing as many cases as possible. You can give a much better personal service. All the clients speak to you individually and, know you, they have better access to you and, that they can just pick up the phone and say, could you just do this for me? It's something I'm much more comfortable with. I'm not someone who's happy and saying, no, I can't do that. Well, I'll do that, but you need to send me this first before I can do it. I think I'm in a much better place, being able to having free rein to do what I want in terms of the clients, to be honest with you.
Wow, it sounds wonderful. Now, Jeremy, the legal aid budget has shrunk in real terms, and more lawyers are refusing to accept legal aid clients. How can we make the justice system fairer so that it is accessible to everyone and not just those who can afford it? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, obviously the big thing is always money, isn't it? And in these times, we're about to learn of new cuts. The criminal justice system is always a very easy target, isn't it, for cuts, because it's very easy to say to the public, we're giving less money to fund criminals defending their cases, and no one is going to stand up in arms and say, well, no, you must give criminals more money to defend themselves. But the reality is, no one knows when they're going to be, subject to the criminal justice system, whether innocent or guilty. unfortunately, given the cuts, not just in real terms, but in actual terms, the legal aid rates are lower. When I started my job 30 years ago, which is ridiculous. I mean, in what other profession can you say that? And yet nothing is done because, it's not an unpopular thing to cut legal aid rates. But the problem is, I go back to bigger firms again and taking on a lot of work, because the only way bigger firms can make it work is by taking on more cases, because they're getting paid less for each case. And because a lot of the work they do now is fixed fee based, they will get paid the same fee, whatever the quality of their representation. It's mostly based on a page count of the evidence in the case. So whether they do an ounce of work or not in trying to defend someone, they will get paid the same amount, which obviously is scary in terms of if you're a defendant. But the main focus of my work is appeal work and miscarriages of justice. And most of that work is the failings of previous representatives, because they've not had the resources or the inclination to do, I wouldn't say a proper job, but a detailed, thorough job, because, I suppose understandably, they're not getting paid for it. So I suppose why would they? But obviously it doesn't help individuals who are subject to the criminal justice system. So in terms of what can be done, it's difficult. It needs more funding. We're not going to get more funding from government. I've long thought whether there should be some tax on commercial firms or firms who don't do any legal aid work that, would allow that to be paid towards the legal aid system. Could be something that can be looked at, but certainly something has to be done, because it's not just legal aid, but it's the court system as well. And, the delays in cases because, they don't have the courtrooms now because the amount of courts that have closed down and court staff, and even the police, investigating crimes, they don't have anything like the resources they need. So one way or the other, greater resources need to be provided, because our criminal justice system is getting worse and worse. I remember doing an interview 10 years ago, I think it was in the aftermath of the Barry George case, in actual fact, where I was asked about, what I thought about could be improved. I think even at that stage, I was talking about legal aid cuts and how, it was going to lead to difficulties in the system. And it's not got better, it's just got worse, unfortunately.
Yes, that's very sad. You've already given us a gem of something that maybe could be done, but just to finish our interview, if you were Lord Chancellor for a day, what would you like to do?
Well, of course, I go back to funding and, certainly fight in the corner to be gaining greater funding for the criminal justice system. But one thing that bothers me is, as I've said, I do a lot of appeal miscarriage of justice work. I find the barrier for overturning convictions to be far too high. It's almost like you don't just have to go in with grounds of appeal, you have to go in satisfying the Court of Appeal that they have no choice but to overturn a conviction, because they take the view that they've been convicted by the court of first instance, so that conviction must be correct. Unless you can 100% show us that that conviction was wrong and should be overturned, we're not going to look at it, which, is understandable on some level, in that they're being convicted by people being convicted by their peers and by a jury. But it creates barriers whereby people who've been languishing in prisons for years, and unless they find that absolute gem that 100% proves that they didn't commit the offence they've been convicted of, then they're going to be languishing in there for life. And I perhaps shouldn't say it because, I'm an officer of the court, but there does sometimes seem to be an impression that there's more concerned about upholding the look that, the justice system is absolutely fine and doesn't have any issues and always gets it right, than to addressing the fact that people who have been wrongly convicted shouldn't be convicted and should have their convictions overturned, if that makes sense. I think sometimes the barriers are far too high in terms of being able to put right things that went wrong. And I think that is something that I would want to address, and how the system could be made fairer, and as I say, how there can be more funding to do that, because certainly for appeals legal aid there is very, very little funding for. So you've got the combination of the very, very high barrier that they have to reach to have a conviction overturned, with very little funding being there to do it, even less so for a trial of first instance. It's really not worth taking on appeals on legal aid. You're better off doing them on pro bono, because it's so restrictive.
Jeremy, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I mean, I'm sure on behalf of The View, I can say thank you so much for your work and how much you're contributing to helping people that need help. So thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Been lovely speaking to you.
Thank you, Jeremy and Madalena, for that fascinating insight into the mind of a criminal defence advocate. It's inspiring to know that people do still care about the profession and that they want to make law accessible and justice more equitable. To find out more about More Justice, Jeremy's new law practice, please check out morejustice.co.uk. Check out The View magazine at theviewmag.org.uk and follow us across all our social media platforms. Thank you for listening.